being with you. I do work here too.
Thank you for being here and for leading.
Yeah, sorry. I'm with you, you're with me, we're with us, I'm with you, all of it, all of it. So before we get started, a really quick question. Does anyone wear a kippah regularly? I'm just curiosity. Nobody? Come on, David. I didn't see your hand go up.
Not regularly.
Not regularly. Ah. Does
I
anyone wear
I grew
a
up at
kippah?
Beth Israel.
I grew up at Beth Israel. It's important. Okay, great. That's it. So I want to be very, very clear. So today I'm not here to convince you to wear a kippah. That is not the end goal of this. We're going to talk and look at some texts that I think are wildly interesting and may, elucidate some idea that you have on where kippot came from, why they were used, and how they were spoken about. Are we ready to jump in?
Sure.
Great. Okay. So we'll start with a picture. I always like to start with a picture. So this comes from the art resource in New York. What do you notice about, just specifically about the head covering? I want to really talk about this because I do think that there is a mistranslation when we think of head covering versus what head coverings typically looked like or what they were. What do you notice about the head covering?
They're like turbans.
They're turbans, yeah. It's right. It's not a kippah, right? It's like a small, delicate thing. No, this is a full wrap. So when we talk about, also notice whose head isn't wrapped in this picture, by the way, interestingly enough.
Ishmael.
Ishmael's and who else is? This is
Child.
driving out Hagar and Ishmael.
Yeah.
So who else also doesn't have their head fully covered?
What you mean?
Sarah.
That's Hagar.
Hagar.
Sarah's probably in the background over here, right? That's her turning her head, and this is Hagar and Ishmael, which is to say, when we talk about head coverings, I want you to kind of get an idea of what they look like. So now we're going to get into, I promise this is the biggest chunk of text we have. The rest will be a little bit easier, but this one is important. Adjustment of the dress. Before beginning service, the dress should first be adjusted, the personal appearance made trim and neat. This is really, really important. We're not going to read this whole thing, but it says, "Oh, worship the Lord in beauty and holiness. One should not stand in prayer while wearing a money belt, nor bareheaded, nor barefoot, where the local custom is to not stand in the presence of the great without shoes, and one should not pray anywhere holding phylacteries in the hand or carrying the scroll of the arms, for the mind would then be preoccupied with those sacred objects." What is important here?
The need to be present when you pray, basically.
Very, very important. Mindfulness is really, really important. What do you notice about, and this is actually something that right, we alluded to. I grew up at Beth Israel. What do we wear at Beth Israel? Anyone know what the dress code is? It's not written anywhere, by the way, but we all know what the dress code is. What is the dress code?
Nice
Is it,
clothing.
what's up? What
Nice
was that?
clothing. I mean,
Nice clothing. However, there is a reasoning for that. I don't want to say that it's like that for no reason. I think the reason also stands similarly to this quote: "A worship the Lord in beauty of holiness." Right? One should be adjusted and the personal appearance made trim and neat, which is simply to say that when we stand in front of God, we do so with not only respect for God, but respect for ourselves, right? It's the same thing as we shower, we adorn ourselves in beauty, right? Because we are adorning the beauty of God. Those two things are related. The way you would dress for a job interview. Why do you dress for a job interview? Why is that important?
First appearances is everything.
Or appearances are important. First appearances, absolutely, but appearance is important. Why else might you dress nicely for a job interview? What does that say about you? What does that say about the job that you want?
It says you're considering it important and special, and you're showing respect for yourself and for the audience.
That's it. That's really it. I would say a lot of that has to do with respect. A lot of that is as noted, that we're cognizant, that we're actually preparing, that we didn't just roll out of bed and walk to this interview out of nowhere, that we gave this time and allowed this to occupy space in our minds, right? Just like it says, right? You don't hold lots of different things. You shouldn't be occupied with all these other things that you're holding. Otherwise, it takes away from your concentration. Okay? So these are two important things to know. Now this story is going to get a little bit more interesting, I promise. Here's where we start. You're going to like this. However, the contradiction between, and we're kind of, again, this is Talmud, so you're jumping into a conversation that's already happening. The contradiction between spitting, in the case where Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi did so, and spitting, where it is deemed tantamount to spitting in the face of the king, is difficult. Let me go on. The Gemara replies, the contradiction between spitting in one case and spitting in the other case is also not difficult, as it is possible to resolve it in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Yehuda said, one who is standing in prayer and saliva happened to accumulate in his mouth, he absorbs it in his garment. And if it was a fine garment and he does not want it to become sullied, he may cover it up in his head covering. That way, one is permitted to spit. The Gemara relates, Ravina was standing behind Rav Ashi during prayer when saliva happened to accumulate in his mouth. So he discharged it behind him. And he said to him, and does the master not hold in accordance with that statement of Rabbi Yehuda, who said, one absorbs it in his head covering? He says, I am delicate, and the mere knowledge that there is spittle in my head covering disturbs my prayer. I love this. Right? So it's to say that there was a ruling. Hold on, give me 1 second. Right? So there was a ruling like, what do? You don't want to spit on the ground. The reason why you don't spit on the ground is, God forbid, and this is the same thing that we have nowadays. God forbid you're spitting and someone's walking by, and when you spit at the ground, traditionally, what does that mean? What are you saying about the person if you're spitting on the ground in front of them?
You're cussing them.
Yeah.
You're cussing them. It's a sign of disrespect. So the rabbis are like, oh, God forbid, we can't have people just spitting on the ground. They're going to think that we disrespect people. If they happen to walk by, they're going to think we're spitting at them. Or God forbid, they're going to think that during our prayer, God forbid, they're spitting at God. Well, what do? Well, we'll stuff it in our heads. And Rava says, I don't want to stuff it in my head. That's gross. I'm going to be thinking about it the whole time. There's going to be spittle on my head. Okay. Now you can see why the story gets interesting. William, you had a question.
Hi, Rabbi Sataloff. First, the spitting is an interesting subject to bring up because the Haredi in Israel and perhaps the ultra-Orthodox in the US use spitting as an expression of contempt for their fellow Jews when their fellow Jews don't live up to their demands for whatever. So it is not just disrespect, it's actual hostility and aggression on the part of the Jews doing this, and it's against their fellow Jews. So if we could go back to your previous slide, I wanted to point out two other things that I think are important here. Can you move back to your previous slide? First of all, this Mishnah says doesn't say, if you say, it says you shouldn't wear a money belt, nor bareheaded, nor barefoot. But then it says where the local customs is not to stand in the presence of the great without shoes. Again, you weren't part of this discussion yesterday, but in our Talmud group, we were talking about the inherent class distinctions within Judaism, starting with Kohanim, Levites, and Israel.
So William, I'm going to interrupt you, and for good reason.
And so this is really getting pretty ugly here. So, but it says particularly where the local custom. So
Correct.
if the local custom is not to pray
Correct.
with a kippah, this is not even being required in this statement here.
So William, like I said before, I'm going to interrupt you, and for a good reason, because local custom is something that we will get to. In fact, that's actually where we are going in this discussion. Part of this discussion is that statement of local custom. We just haven't gotten to those slides yet. And the other point that I will make concerning Jews spitting on other Jews, whatever that may be, it is a human condition. It is a human quality that typically human behavior, or maybe in the last, however, a few thousands of years, that spitting at someone simply is a sign of contempt. I will, unfortunately, for the sake of this conversation, I do not want to get into a false dichotomy between Orthodox and Reform, that this isn't a conversation of denomination and maybe some terse disagreements between one another. I will simply say the rabbis are dealing with what to do when saliva accumulates in your mouth. However, they're cognizant of what it might look like to others. That's the most important distinction I want to make here, but I'm going to move on, if that's okay with everyone. Can we move on to the next slide? Okay, great. So here in Kiddushin, the Gemara relates, once Rabbi Chia bar Abba encountered Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and he saw that he had placed an inexpensive covering on his head and brought his child to the synagogue to study. Rabbi Chia bar Abba said to him, "What is the reason for all this fuss, as you're in such a hurry that you did not have time to dress yourself properly?" What is the issue here? This is something that we've already kind of discussed and talked about. It's actually something that resonates in this idea of spitting.
It's just showing disrespect again.
Disrespect. The rabbis are really concerned with the notion of respect. They're concerned with the notion of, as my father would like to say, it's not what it is, it's what it looks like. I'll say it again. It's not what it is, it's what it looks like.
Well,
Spitting is spitting.
Chia is trying to act as if he is the arbiter and authority here, but he is actually disrespecting Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, who wanted to make sure that he got to the synagogue on time with his child to study.
Correct. So there seems to be this awkward encounter, right? He's trying to rush, I'm sure if you've had kids, when you're trying to rush your kids out the door to get them to school on time, they may not be wearing the same socks, right? They may forget something. They may forget to put, the underwear on backwards, right? It's almost like that. But what he's saying is, right, he placed this inexpensive head covering, which is to say, what is the issue here? I don't necessarily care so much about who's right and who's wrong, but what are they bringing attention to? What is the Talmud trying to tell us about the importance of maybe dress or attire? Because this class really isn't just about head coverings. It's really about really about decorum, and it's really about respect. And again, it's really about what it looks like. So what is the disagreement, or what is the issue here? What's being brought up? Any idea with the child-parent relationship? Let's talk about that for a moment. As parents, are we often judged by what our kids look like when they walk out the door?
Yes,
For the most part, yes.
sadly.
Right, which is to say, right, so Ricky, maybe you could elaborate on that for just a moment.
Well, I mean, the kids have trouble at school even if they don't look a certain way. If, this one has this and that one has that. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's unfortunate. Is it, and it brings up the question, is it more important to be there or to look a certain way? It's, and you see this in churches, for example, and, not everyone has a Sunday best. They dress the best they can, which may not be as good as someone else, but they're there. So what's more important, to be there, or is it disrespectful to not be dressed properly?
Right. Notice it says the underlining context is it was an inexpensive head covering.
Right. That's what so
exactly.
He didn't have a fancy turban on. He, whatever the local dress was at the time, he threw something on his head.
He threw something on his kid's head. He needed to get there in time. And what he did is he got scuff from the other parents in the room, right? Again, which is to say, history repeats itself. This is this isn't new, I feel like, especially, right? We live in Houston, we all understand. However, there's also something here to be said, that there's this confrontation between what our children have. I'm really sorry, so I can't see the chat for some reason. It's people feel that, yes, people feel that the children are a reflection of the parents. Exactly. And that's also what they're being called for, which is to say, your child needs to be dressed properly because it's a reflection on you, right? Again, it's not that the child is doing something wrong. It's that the parents kind of are responsible for their children. And in some ways, there's a projection. That's really what a lot of this conversation is. You'll find that a lot of my discussions, and those who do Talmud study or really study with me, I try to get at the root of human behavior. And the root of human behavior revolving head coverings is really this idea of what things look like. Next slide. We ready to move on?
Well, Rabbi, I just have a question.
Yes.
Is that why the ultra-Orthodox wear such expensive hats?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I would say 1,000%. There's a reason why they dress in beautiful silk garments. They are not cheap.
Right.
These shadles, the $10,000 shadles that the women wear on their heads, those aren't cheap. These aren't inexpensive. And a lot of this is a part of a theology. And the theology is that one stands before God, not disheveled. The only time that one is really allowed to stand disheveled in front of God is what? And we'll actually get to this. What is the one time that you can be completely unkempt, barefoot?
When you're mourning.
Grieving.
When you're grieving, and exactly. when you're mourning. And the rabbis will make a huge distinction. They'll actually, this whole idea of being barefoot, they'll keep talking about being barefoot a lot. Being barefoot and your head being uncovered. And what this actually has to do a lot of with is they're making a distinction between times that you're in mourning and times that you are not in mourning. Appearances, again, right? Appearances are everything. Why is it important that, and this is kind of a weird concept, when we go to someone's house who's mourning, would we find it interesting if they were dressed in a tuxedo or dressed to the nines? Would there anything be weird or uncomfortable about that?
Of course.
What would be uncomfortable? Yes, exactly. Tell me more about that.
Well, I mean, isn't that why we render the garment? I mean, tear the garment to show that they're in mourning, and that, I mean, isn't that part of that?
It is part of that. But
And-
why do we go unshoveled? Why do we tear? Why do we not shave? Why do we do all those things?
Because we're I believe it's because we're so sad and grieving the loss of our loved one.
We're also not supposed to think about, I mean, in more traditional households, people cover mirrors for the
Right.
week so that you do not see your reflection, so that you aren't to be thinking of yourself.
Exactly. Your appearance should be the last thing that you possibly think about during a time of mourning, right? If one is dressed to the nines in a tuxedo during a time of mourning, there may be the inference on the part of others that maybe that their attention is too much on themselves. Again, this is the perception. However, the reason why we do that is because we let ourselves go. We give ourselves over. We respect those who are gone from our lives by literally almost kind of like removing ourselves from the equation. We don't dress, we don't shower. It's not important. It's not important because appearances aren't important at that moment. What's important is remembering our loved ones. Does this all kind of make sense? I just want to make sure that we're all kind of thinking about head coverings in a much larger way.
Well,
Okay.
Rabbi Sataloff, I've got a big problem with this standing before God, because it is really anthropomorphic to think of standing before God. And if there is one thing that I think is very clear in the Torah, is that God is not anthropomorphic. He is undescribable and not, there's all this primitive stuff in the Torah about, oh, well, his dwelling house is the tent of meeting and blah, 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 and then subsequently the temple. It is a primitive way of thinking about God, particularly for Jews, and particularly for Jews who have already had the temple destroyed. So who are you appearing in front of? Oh yeah, it's your fellow Jews. And what's the issue there? Oh, you can't afford a fur hat. You can't afford the proper head covering, perhaps because you're paying more attention to your child than to your physical appearance.
It's simply what we are
a
making.
difficult, not an admirable concept here that's being described.
I think it's a very admirable concept that is being described. It's one that happens throughout pretty much entire history, that appearances do matter, that we adorn ourselves. The theological implication is that we adorn ourselves because we are adorning God, that we are a part of God, right? Our bodies are not ours. Our bodies are God. And we dress our bodies in ways that reflect our admiration and our respect for God. That would be my response to that. And you're right, the anthropomorphism, it happens a lot, but I really don't want to get into it because that is not exactly what this class is about. It is simply a placeholder to think about the concept of God. That you're right. There's placed all the time above the ark. In fact, I have a talit that I don that says, "Da lifnei ata omed," know before whom you stand. And you are absolutely right, William, that not only do we stand in front of God, we stand in front of other Jews. However, when we stand in front of others, we all want to make sure that we are on the same page, that we are all there with the same admiration and respect, not only for ourselves, but for one another. And sometimes a uniform is how we do that. A talit is how we do that. We're going to get to that in just a bit, but I want to get to something else. And this goes more into the head covering piece of the conversation. As Rabbi says, that Rabbi Yochanan says, in the future, the Holy One, blessed be He, will prepare a sukkah for the righteous from the skin of the Leviathan. Prepare a sukkah. We're going to talk about this. As it is stated, can you fill his skin with barbed irons? If one is deserving of being called righteous, an entire sukkah is prepared for him from the skin of the Leviathan. If one is not deserving of this honor, a covering is prepared for his head, as it is stated, or his head with fish spears. If one is deserving at least of this reward, a covering is prepared for him, and as if not deserving, a necklace is prepared for him, as it is stated, a necklace is about your neck. What does this mean? They're using this piece of Job. The righteous, right, will prepare a sukkah for the righteous from the skin. What does a sukkah do? What is the purpose of a sukkah?
Well, it is a booth without, it's a temporary booth. I mean, the way I think of a sukkah anyway, it's a temporary house, so to speak.
Okay, great. So
it's a reminder of how the Jews were leaving Egypt and going to the Holy Land, going to Israel, to Canaan.
Exactly. You walk in a sukkah and you have this covering, right? You're kind of reminded when you walk in, you have this covering above you. And this covering above you is very, very important, because when you walk in and you see the schach, right? You see those branches above you, right? You're reminded that that time is special, that you're in a sukkah, that you're being covered. Ufros aleinu sukat shlomecha, right? It's a prayer, the part of that we say for during the Hashkivenu, right? Let God place a shelter above our heads, right? Because that's really what it is. It's a shelter, right? There's something about the sheltering presence of the sukkah that we are reminded of, that we walk in during that time. And that's what the rabbis are getting at here. This idea, because they say, well, if you're not righteous enough for a sukkah, for a whole sukkah, at least give you a head covering, right? Which is to say, well, maybe you don't get the mansion, but at least you'll get a tiny hut to put above you. Why? Right? Because they're using that piece from Job. They take that very seriously, right? They're saying that if the righteous are really righteous, they will have a sukkah prepared for them. However, we demonstrate righteousness by having something above us. That's really, really important. That's often why, it's usually why I feel like people say they wear a yarmulke, a reminder of something above. But what this is actually is almost, in a sense, a type of protection. A sukkah is considered a protectorate, right? Why? Because it's a shelter. Any type of shelter is a sense of protection, right? When you're under something, it means that you have something to protect you above you, whether it be small pieces of palm branches, but at least it's. Does that make sense? So now we're getting into this idea of having something above us. This idea, right? The skin of a Leviathan. Obviously, no one's going to have the skin of Leviathan taped to their heads, but you can see how they're trying to say, well, if they can't have that, let's have something.
Rabbi, does this have any correlation in Christianity where in the New Testament, Jesus said, I'm going before you to prepare the house for you in heaven?
Probably not. That's probably more talking about the temple in and of itself.
So it's
But
not about a home for the righteous when they arrive in heaven.
Sure. No. And so this is like, sorry, let me be clear. This is before death. This is like now.
Right.
This isn't, you'll wear a kippah, you'll get a head covering when you get to heaven. It's like, no, the righteous now currently, right? Which is to say that there's already now this burgeoning correlation between having something above you and righteousness. And these things will start to slowly merge together in some concrete ways much later. But we're not going to get to that. But that's kind of where this conversation is certainly going. Anyone have any questions so far? No? Okay.
I do. I have a question.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Look, but a Leviathan is a mythical creature.
Correct.
It's not a real fish.
Correct.
So all of this is really just a metaphor for telling a story, making a story.
What is
the message?
What is the importance of the Leviathan? We can dig down this one. It'll be fun.
Well, if
what
it's
does the Leviathan represent?
I don't know. I just know.
Well, this is coming from Job. So we have that whole story of the whale.
This is the Leviathan. This is
This
the
is not
giant
it's not a whale.
Godzilla Jewish creature that lives in the sea.
Well, I guess
that God has to contain himself, contain God's self from unleashing. So the symbol of the Leviathan is what? The all-encompassing power of God.
Mm-hmm.
It's taming. This idea that you would have the skin of the Leviathan is this notion that you would be able to tame. Someone said, it's the Leviathan is big. That this idea that you would be able to kind of tame the unwieldiness, the unlimited power of God, and somehow, right, the righteous will somehow find a delicate balance, find a correlation, find a relationship with the unwielding power of God. Not only will they do that, but they'll be able to kind of bend it in such a way as to make for themselves a shelter. How does that sound? Someone said the head covering is much smaller, less threatening, less powerful. What's the deal with the necklace? We're not going to get into the necklace today. That's also, it has to do with adorning. It has to do with the adoration of God. We adorn ourselves. Necklaces are usually a part of that. But what I really wanted to get to, Miriam, is that, right, this idea that you could take the Leviathan, skin it, and somehow make yourself a shelter, it's really sheltering yourself in the presence of God's power. And what that narrows down to in its micro version is a head covering. Great. Okay. Sorry, a lot of this is metaphor. I apologize, but a lot of this is metaphor. A lot of this is interpretive. As I tell everyone, this stuff is not science. If you're looking for a science class, you've come, I think, to the wrong place, because I barely passed chemistry. Okay. The Gemara cites another incident involving honor. See a lot of that. Honor, reverence. One demonstrates for his teacher. Once when Ravina was sitting before Rabbi Yirmiyah of Difti, a certain man passed before him, and he did not cover his head. William, you're going to like this one. Ravina said, "How rude is this man? He does not show respect by covering his head in the honor of a rabbi. Rabbi Yirmiyah of Diti said to him, perhaps he is from the city of Mata, Maseya, where rabbis are common, and the people living there are consequently not as careful to display honor as those in other places.
Brilliant.
There are rabbis everywhere. You know, it's like, kid. What do you think? What does this passage say to you?
That in this instance, Rabbi Yirmiyah of Difti is a lot smarter and more thoughtful than Ravina, who was sitting before him.
Right? Because again, as William noted, these are Jews judging other Jews, how other Jews are being Jews. That hasn't stopped, by the way, in case anyone was wondering. Still happens. Still happens. Right?
I mean, custom is always, it drives a lot of things. And even when we talk about the very expensive hats that, you know, the Orthodox wear, heaven forbid you shouldn't have one, because something will be said. And it has nothing to do with religion or spirit. It has to do with social, what's the word I want to use? Anyway, with custom.
Bingo.
It
Winner,
also
winner.
seems to apply that a dearth of rabbis is better than a plethora of rabbis.
Sure.
I have told this story more than once, but it's, again, the custom at Beth Israel. At least when I was growing up, the custom was one did not wear a yarmulke. But when my daughter was bat mitzvahed, I got a whole bunch of them for my conservative friends who were coming. And I was told I could not put them out. So I still have that bag of yarmulkes from quite a while ago because it was the custom at Beth Israel. And now, of course, that's totally different.
And that's exactly what I was going to say. Here's the thing about customs. They change. They change. That's why these stories are so relevant, because so many of these stories are exactly like, it's almost human behavior hasn't changed, but all these customs have, and they know it too. They're identifying basically the fact that, hey, this guy's coming into our city not doing the thing that we're so used to. And the other guy's like, hey, maybe he comes from a place where like that's just not the thing that they do there. Which is exactly how we feel all the time, especially when going to a new synagogue. Oh my goodness. I don't know about you all, but I get like anxiety. I'm like, am I wearing the right talit? Am I wearing the right shoes? Everyone's wearing a blue shirt. I'm wearing a yellow shirt. Like, was I supposed to wear a tie? Is this a no tie kind of a place? Was I like, I'm dressed in a tuxedo. Everyone's wearing jeans. Like, and yet it's like, there's not a lick of Hebrew. The whole thing's in English. Sometimes the whole thing's in English, and no, it's like, you don't know. And it can be very challenging. I feel like that's a part of this whole conversation about kippot, because really it's a conversation of dress, a conversation of how we think of others, how we judge others, how we judge ourselves. All of these things are really, really important factors in not just wearing kippot, but thinking about the notion of what a kippah represents and what the clothing that we wear represents, right? And also thinking about when other people come into our places that we're so used to what we're used to. And it can be very hard and challenging to be in those spaces, especially when we know, based on rabbinics, people are going to be people. I promise you, this, however old this tractate is, people still act this way. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're right. When I grew up at Beth Israel and I went to Beth Israel or to Beth Jacob in Galveston, I put on a tallis and a yarmulke because I respected their way of observing. And I thought it was disrespectful of my way of observing when somebody from Beth Israel or Beth Jacob came to Beth Israel and insisted on wearing a yarmulke and a tallis because that was not our custom. So I thought they were being disrespectful. But I think I've learned after Rabbi Karp beat me over the head long and hard and Rabbi Line that in Reform Judaism, we should be more, being Reform has a tolerance level and it's not disrespectful, and we should be a bit broader tent. And so that's why I think the custom has changed at Beth Israel.
It's changed, but I want you to see these customs as like doing this weird, like all over the place thing. Because guess who's the only clergy who doesn't wear a kippah?
You.
Me.
You. Hadn't gone unnoticed.
Guess who grew up in a conservative synagogue for half of his life? Me.
Yeah. Well, Rabbi Karp never wore a kippah.
Right.
Yeah,
like
I find it very interesting. I learned this principle very young, but about women's head coverings. I was in a Reform congregation in the 1950s in Massachusetts. And 1 year women were supposed to wear hats, like our Christian neighbors, for Rosh Hashanah, for instance. For the high holidays, the word would go out what the expected dress code was. The next year, it was hair ribbons, not a full hat, just a token hair ribbon. Another year, it was just a veil. Another year, it was your bare hair. And this was all for girls under bat mitzvah age, and it might have been different for adult women, but it was a very clear dress code and it kept changing. So I learned the lesson very young that you're trying to teach.
Is right across the street. Huh?
That it's just a custom that the Ritual and Practices Committee has decided on.
And here's the thing, it changes all the time. Here's what I want you guys to take away. What you think is respectful 1 year may be found disrespectful another year. It is mind-boggling how crazy it is, how much switching we have to do. It's like keeping up with fashion. Like 1 year, it's completely disrespectful. I get yelled at all the time for not wearing a kippah. Finally, Rabbi Lion was like, you can do what you want. I was like, great, because I don't know what to do. I can wear, so sometimes, and I always ask people this, and the only time I ask people is before a wedding. And I say to them, do you want me to wear a kippah? And they said, well, I don't know, what do you want to do? And I said, I need you to understand that wearing a kippah it means, it doesn't mean anything to me. All it does for me, going back to our early text, it's a distraction. It actually keeps me from being focused because it falls off, it's moving, it's something on my head. I don't like them at all. But I'll wear one if you think that's what you want. Because quite honestly, like that's the thing is like, I don't have an opinion, but I want to go with whatever you want. If you feel like when you look back, you want your rabbi to be wearing a kippah in your wedding pictures, I'll put one on, because the point is it doesn't mean anything to me, but it might mean something to you. And I will happily oblige if that's what makes you better, because we are there to honor the day. I am not there to get into an argument over the meaning of a kippot. We're there to honor the couple and bring them into holiness and create a sacred time.
So how do you justify your talisim? Wearing a talis?
The talis, that's ordained. You have to wear a talis. That one I feel is very, very special. It's very special because it feels to me, it's a little bit of a different conversation, the talit. It actually has very, very different origins. And I want you guys to notice that the idea of a kippah is new. A prayer shawl is very, very different. That's of biblical origin. And the idea for me of a prayer shawl is for me a blessing of honor. It was one that was given to me on my bar mitzvah as an honor. It's one that I wear as a rabbi to symbolically put myself as a shaliach tzibor, as a leader of prayer. And I wear one at a wedding because for me, that is an honor of I'm donning this piece of clothing that is imbuing me with the ability to make a couple holy. I view it very, very differently than like, I don't know what to do with my spit, I'll put it on my head. I want to make that distinction. That's why kind of going through these texts sometimes, I think about kippot and I think about their origin, and I'm just not sold on it. I mean, I'll give you my personal preference. Like, I'm just not sold on it. Many people have tried to sell me on it. I've gotten chewed out at many conservative synagogues. I now just put one on because I don't care. If it makes you happy, that's what makes me happy. Okay, we're gonna keep moving. There's, I think, one or two more. And this goes into some laws, and we can kind of end here. If not the fact that I do not usually dispute earlier authorities unless there is a great authority to support me, I would incline toward leniency and in favor of reciting blessings with an uncovered head. Even the resuscitation of Shema is permitted, for it states in Midrash Rabba, right? A flesh and blood king sends his charter to the province. What do? All residents of the province stand up, uncover their heads, and read it with fear, awe, and trembling and perspiration. But the Holy One says, blessed be he, says to Israel, recite the Shema, my charter. I do not trouble you to read it standing or with your heads uncovered. This clearly implies it is forbidden to uncover one's head. Rather, he did not impose an uncovered head as stringency. But what can I do? They have already ruled this to be forbidden. Here's another great example. At Beth Israel, do we stand up for the Shema? We typically do.
You do, but you don't have to.
You don't have to.
You don't have to be told to stand up. If you're already sitting, you can stay seated.
Exactly.
And they do. That's how I was raised.
So,
but I was raised conservative Orthodox.
However, I want to note the point here that they're kind of making is that typically when you walk, I gave a sermon last week about wearing my mariner's hat. And I walked into a building and I got yelled at because I was told that in the South, what don't you do inside in the South?
You're supposed to take your hat off.
You're supposed to take your hat off. But it's confusing because Jews are like, no, but for us, you keep your hat on because it's a sign of respect. And they're like, no, you take your hat off. So you can see how the culture of Judaism enmeshed with the larger social culture can be conflicting at times. And it can be really confusing that sometimes, right, we follow in such a way, probably in the South especially, that you uncover your head when you walk into a building to show respect, which is probably where a lot of the Reform traditions came about. Right? A lot through Southern decorum, or just American decorum in general.
Yeah,
however,
before
you can see,
men wore hats and they did take them off.
Right? But it's confusing. If everyone is walking away a little bit more confused than they were when they walked in, then I feel like I've done my job. But if everyone feels that they have a little bit of clarity on maybe why they're confused, then I know that I've done my job well. Sorry, yes.
Sorry, I was just going to say, isn't there something in the Torah that says that when they came before the tabernacle, they covered their heads, and that's where things, maybe I'm making this up, but I thought I had heard this, that was in the Torah.
Oh, wait. I have one more slide, Ricky.
Oops, sorry.
I told you. Guys, I promise. I won't let you down. I got you. I wasn't going to get to this, but I have also found this written in the name of Rabbi Meir, namely that this all matter of pious practice. Although Rabbi Peretz wrote that one should object to someone entering the synagogue with an uncovered head, however, Torah does not state, and he shall cover his head. Except with, right? So yes, you are, that there is a biblical proclamation, right, about covering their head. However, there are a lot of antidotes that don't have that. In fact, the most important part was that they were priests, that there is a priestly class, and that priestly class is a little bit different from your everyday Israelite, which also for me goes back to the concept of a tallis, which is why when you're a leader in prayer, you wear a tallis during certain times, like a wedding. At a wedding, no one else has a talit on except for the rabbi, because that is a dawning of priestlyhood, which is a little bit different. It also has to do with kind of the sukkah and the why you sometimes you wear, you have a chuppah, right? You have a covering above you, right? Usually it's sometimes it's a tallis, but absolutely, Ricky, that there are biblical proclamations that have to do with head covering, but those specifically pertain to Aaron and the Kohanim, which are a little bit different, a little bit different.
I just thought that they extrapolated from that to why the everyday person should cover their head.
And here's what we didn't do. What we didn't do today is I didn't give you the reasoning for why people wear a kippah today. And there's a really good reason why I didn't do that. Because it goes back to the very first thing that I said. I am not here to persuade you to wear a kippah or not to wear a kippah. All we're here to do is to talk about why people wear them and the human behaviors that go along with wearing one and with not wearing one. My personal preference is I don't wear one. It's distracting. And as you saw from the very first text, that distracts me in prayer. And if it distracts me in prayer, then it's not worth it. Because for me, my priority is prayer and intentionality, and then making sure I look good doing it. But in that order. Right? It's the same thing. I don't care how good you look in a suit, but if your sermon is terrible, then it's terrible. It's like it doesn't matter. Those values and those priorities, one needs to decide for themselves, but those are mine. Those are mine. I don't care how good of a Jew that you are because you wear silk gowns. If you have the audacity to spit at another Jew, William, that's not in my priority. It's not in my list. But that's me. That's me. I think Sewell Martin. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that name.
That's okay. I was going to say though, we all can just pick and choose whatever we like to do. They can't raise children saying to them, you may pick and choose whatever you would like to do.
Of course we can raise children, allowing them to pick and choose what they like to do. I feel like that's a really important part of finding and ensuring that your children pursue what they're interested in. However, part of this is delineating them values. It's not you can do whatever you want.
That's what you're saying.
Allow people to.
If I don't like to wear something, I will not do it. But you may do it, and you may do it. But you are the leader. You are our role model. It comes from the top down. And with children, it's the same thing. You're saying to them, you can do your homework, you can't do your homework. It's okay. You have a choice. You're free to do it.
Mark Sherman raised his hand.
Hey guys, how are you? Good to see everybody. Rabbi, I look forward to meeting you in person. Excited for you to be here. So Judaism is not the Greeks. We don't do things by visual symbolism. As a matter of teaching, we do things in our minds and by speech and communication. As far as symbolisms of leadership, it is actually the teaching from the leadership that matters, not the actual trope of symbolism, in my opinion. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Sure. I want to say this. We don't teach, I believe that the personality of Reform Judaism is this, in my opinion. I wasn't I wasn't taught or expressly told what choices to make, but I learned how to make choices. But I wasn't told this is exactly what you need to do, but I was given the value structure that would help me make the right choices. And that was always something very, very important in my family, that my father gave to us our family values. The way those values translate into the world may be translated differently. My sister, for myself, I became a rabbi. My sister works for a JCC. But the inherent values that we were taught, those are what's important. How we express them a little bit differently is a little bit different. And I'd say the notion of wearing a kippah, for me, is less important than you understanding Jewish identity, that you understanding Hebrew, that you have fluidity in prayer, that you have connection to community. When I list out everything that's important to me about a service, everything that's important to me about Judaism, the concept of wearing a kippah for me does not fall very high, but that for me is important because I get to choose where on that value list that it is. And it's the same for every single person here, and it's the same for every single denomination. That's why people go to Beth Yashern. It's why people go to Beth Israel. It's why people go to Orami. It's why people go to Emmanuel. They decide what values in Judaism fit higher on their priority list and which ones don't. However, that's on us. We have the intellect. As Rashi says, we were given the intellect to decide, to make choices, to discern. That intellect is a Jewish value. We teach. We don't teach and tell people what choices to make, but we teach them how to make choices. I'm not sure if that satiates anyone's curiosity, but that's my answer. William.
But isn't that more of a reform and maybe conservative view of Judaism and the ultra Orthodox are doctrinal. I mean, they don't think there's exceptions.
Absolutely. They're orthopractic. Absolutely. I would say that's exactly right. That's why I became a Reform rabbi, because that fit with me. If for some reason that didn't, which I tried on for a bit as I lived in Jerusalem and davened and lived in an Orthodox community, I decided that that wasn't the right path for me. That I wasn't someone who I felt like needed those rules and that stringency, right? And then come the knowledge. I was someone who had to come about it in a different way. And I feel like that's what it is for all learners, right? We can't, which is to say, I love this. It's like this old, an old quote. It's like, you can't judge a giraffe by how quickly it runs. You can't judge a hippo by its ability to climb a tree. Like, everyone's going to have their different value sets. And part of Reform Judaism is understanding what your priorities are. That's all what we're here to do. And it's also to say that sometimes those priorities change within our denomination. Sometimes not wearing a kippah is considered blasphemy. Sometimes wearing it is considered blasphemy. It means that things change. It means that we change.
Okay, what I was going to say was here to what you say, Rabbi Sataloff, about the importance of the education of children and teaching them that they need to make choices. The choices should be based in values and also knowledge and their own thought process. So, Sewell, I would, if you're still there, I don't know if she's still there. It's worrisome to hear you say that you want an authority to descend down and then descend down to the parent, because this is liberal Judaism, in which the importance of an individual commitment to the religion is paramount, especially compared to Orthodoxy, where it is racial and that utter conformity is required, except that you may notice that one Orthodox sect has one set of practices and a different Orthodox sect has a completely different set of practices. And then again, we get back to my issue about classism within Judaism. You have utter disrespect on the part of the Ashkenazi Haredi in Israel for the Mizrahim. And think about what they did to the Ethiopian Jews who were forced to, quote, convert to Judaism because their brand of Judaism wasn't good enough for the hierarchy. It preserved the Ethiopian Jews for millennia, but that wasn't good enough for, the contempt that is inherent in this rule-driven, authority-driven approach to Judaism. It's fundamentally wrong. So, and I think that the more children are guided, the more children are educated, the more they identify with being Jewish. And I don't know if Sewell is still there, but take a look around and look at the pictures of how many children were just in Beth Israel 50 years ago compared to now.
Let me make just one comment, but I also want to be really cautious of everyone's time because I have to run. And this is my remark. I don't care what's on your head. I care what's in your head. I'll say it again. I don't care what's on your head. I care what's in your head. That's important. And there's always, as we saw in the Talmud, there's always going to be judgment. Everyone's going to think that their form of Judaism, that the way they practice it, their custom, where they're from, that's the right way. That's always going to be the Jewish problem. It's not going anywhere. It's what we live with. It is. And our goal is to help people identify in ways that find meaning in Jewish practice. They're going to do it differently. They're going to do it in ways that we've never seen. And that is part of Lador Vador. It's understanding that the generations that are coming from us, before us, are going to practice Judaism differently. And what we hand down to them can't just be what you should wear to the synagogue. It has to be more than that. It has to be with more intention. It has to be a bigger conversation. It can't just be, here's what you should dress. It needs to be deeper. It needs to have meaning, because as we saw, fashion trends, they come and go. But a good heart, that stays. And that's important. Okay?
Well said. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
It was lovely being with you all today. I really appreciate it. I will see you all very soon. Tzarayim Tovim. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.